February the 3rd, 1954. Australia aglow, eager and ready for the arrival of Queen Elizabeth and the Duke of Edinburgh. Thousands kept a night-long vigil, ensuring a vantage point for the great occasion. Morning, and the Royal Yacht Gothic, escorted by units of the Navy and Air Force, move up Sydney Harbour to the resounding cheers of thousands lining the foreshores and crammed aboard a huge fleet of pleasure craft. Through a laneway of small craft, the royal barge made its way to Farm Cove, where Governor Phillip had landed in 1788. Queen Elizabeth II, the first ruling monarch ever to set foot on this land, was greeted by the Governor-General, Sir William Slim, the Governor of New South Wales, Sir John Northcott, service chiefs, politicians and other dignitaries. More than 500,000 people lined the gaily decorated city streets for the royal progress. Never before had there been such demonstrations of loyalty and outbursts of spontaneous affection. For 10 days, the royal couple maintained a split-second schedule throughout the state. Unforgettable experience was the Surf Carnival at Bondi Beach, the biggest ever staged, with 53 teams taking part in the March Past. It was a most impressive and exciting spectacle for the visitors. Highlights of the long program were the boat races, which held the interest of the smiling prince. The Duke, sailor-born and proved in the test of war, was one who appreciated Manus Island, venue for the biggest air-sea exercise ever held off our coast, and a strategic point in Australia's northern defence line. Codenamed SATEX, the manoeuvres were designed to test anti-submarine technique. The aircraft carrier Sydney, under the command of Rear Admiral Dowling, was the flagship. Role of the enemy played by the British submarine Thorough. Air Force and Navy officers planned the exercise in the briefing room aboard Sydney. 6 units of the British Far East Fleet, led by HMS Birmingham, took part in the exercise, which featured patrols by Sea Furies, launched by catapult and guided by radar, culminating in the bombing attack by Neptunes. A kill is recorded, but only on paper. From Pearl Harbor came ships of the American Pacific Fleet for the annual Coral Sea celebrations. More than 3,000 ratings poured into Sydney for a week of sightseeing and relaxation. Many visited Taronga Park Zoo. In Brisbane, Admiral Halsey, famed and aggressive director of Pacific War strategy, led a contingent in a special service at the American Memorial.
It is only fitting that we pause during this week of commemoration and pay tribute to these valiant men and recall that those who did not return did so, knowing that the course which they died was just.
Presence of the famous American sailor recalled the grim loss of life in the New Guinea campaigns. Bomana Cemetery in Papua is one of the many hallowed plots. the last resting place of heroes. Some graves unnamed. One, that of Jack French, first to win a Victoria Cross in Papua. During her visit to Melbourne, the Queen attended a solemn dedication ceremony at the Shrine of Remembrance. Her Majesty was escorted by Lieutenant General Sir Edmund Herring, Chairman of the Shrine Trustees. The Queen, in her dedication speech, reminded us of the sacrifices made in the war. Her pressed button lit a symbolic flame in a brazier in the open forecourt. This flame, which will never be extinguished, is an everlasting memorial to the fallen of World War II. But there were happier interludes as the royal couple moved among the younger generation of Australians. At Flemington Racecourse, Her Majesty received a special thrill when the Queen Elizabeth Stakes was won by Cromus, whose sire was owned by her late father, King George VI. From turf to tennis. A visit to Kooyong to meet Lawn Tennis Association President Sir Norman Brooks, who presented the royal visitors with a replica of the Davis Cup, won a few months previously from America, and to be introduced to Mr. Tennis himself, Harry Hoffman. Looks like the Duke wants some inside tips on this tennis racket. But for our #1 player, Lou Hode, there was a different service coming up. National service, in which the Wimbledon champion was obliged to substitute a rifle for a racket. And this footwear would hardly do for the centre court. Here's a call-up for muscle men from all corners of the continent. And this panel of judges are subjected to a dazzling display of muscular calisthenics. Not only the men were goggle-eyed as the dogged disciples of the dumbbells displayed their prowess. Presented with the 100 Guinea Cup, John Penman, Mr. Australia, 1954. The Royal Tour of Queensland opened with a spectacular tableau by schoolchildren at Brisbane's exhibition ground. Then, as the royal couple travelled north, they saw new aspects of Australian life. In Cairns, Torres Strait natives enthusiastically presented a war dance. The Royal Yacht Gothic steamed to the Barrier Reef, where the Queen and Duke were introduced to the wonders of its bird and marine life. Sights to be seen nowhere else in the world. Also inside the reef was the grand old lady of the Australian fleet, the 27-year-old cruiser Australia, soon to be paid off and sold for scrap. The Queen and Duke were piped aboard to watch a march past on the quarterdeck. Later, they posed for photographs with the ship's company. After 3 years in Korea flying Mustangs and then Gloucester Meteor twin jets, 77 Squadron returned home, a gallant band who flew 1,900 sorties. 42 of our pilots died, but the squadron accounted for thousands of buildings, bridges, vehicles, and MiG fighters. Also back from Korea came 1,100 soldiers, gallant men who for 4 years had lived up to the highest traditions of Anzac in yet another war. The men of the 3rd Battalion, the first Australian unit to go to Korea. Tears of joy flowed freely ranks were broken as the heroes answered a call to arms. The arms of their loved ones. Heroes of the 3rd, who brought back a George Medal, 17 military crosses, 29 military medals, and an American presidential citation for their part in the bloody Battle of Capillon. It was kids and cuddles for the happy warriors. Together again, and the tides of emotion run high in a paradox of laughter and tears. A joyous reunion in victory and peace. Back in Canberra, it was a solemn, reflective moment in the national capital as the royal wreath was laid on the memorial. On to the House of Representatives for the opening by Her Majesty of Federal Parliament.
Mr. President and members of the Senate, Mr. Speaker and members of the House of Representatives, in the earnest hope that divine providence may guide your deliberations and further the welfare of the people of the Commonwealth of Australia, I now leave you to the discharge of your high and important duties.
A busy day of official engagements ended with a glittering state ball in King's Hall. Among the guests were many representatives of the diplomatic corps. The Queen arrived with the Prime Minister. Then it was on with the dance with regal dignity. But at Luna Park, with much less dignity, the girls were also cutting their way to a woodchopping championship. From 15 to 50, these able axewomen were literally aged in the wood. But it was the youngest, Jan Morris, who proved that when she got to loggerheads with a log, she was a tip-top chip chopper. Where there are splinters, needles are not far away. And with the introduction of an Australia-wide diphtheria immunization campaign, there was another call to arms, answered by babes in arms and tiny tots. The older recruits showed varied signs of emotion in fearful anticipation of the ordeal ahead. As for the littlies, they couldn't have cared less. Uh-oh, this'll hurt. Well, what do you know? Not so terrible after all. This little darling has grown up as a pet of the faunos of New Zealand and has developed the sociable habit of eating in the kitchen. A habit which, now that darling has grown up, is most embarrassing. This darling certainly knows when she's well off. What do you say, girls? Cows and confined spaces don't mix, and the difficult job of getting darling back to the pasture gets tougher every day. More than 4,000 excited youngsters throng Sydney Airport to greet their cowboy hero of film, radio, and comics, the Pied Piper of Hollywood, Hopalong Cassidy, with his wife Tripalong, alias Mrs. William Boyd, here to raise funds for crippled children. A colourful showman with a genuine affection for the younger brigade. But here's a brigade of brigands. Shades of the Spanish Main? No, just the shooting of a scene at Pagewood Studios where Byron Haskin was directing Robert Newton and young Australian actor Kit Taylor in Long John Silver. A Treasure Island setting in a Sydney suburb.
That medallion, now, what do you know about it?
Nothing. Why?
It'd be a counterpart to a map I found in the sea chest I took away from Treasure Island. It points the way to more of Flint's gold still hidden there. 900,000 pounds.
Then came Willing Shilling Week, aimed at bolstering the funds of the Girl Guides Association. And a lone wolf in guide's clothing sets out to make a bob or two for the old troop. Gertie Davy, pride of the pack, sometimes known as Jack. She's all set to clean the brass or mind the kids or rub two Boy Scouts together to light a fire. Hey, what goes on? How many pairs of hands do you think a girl's got, you canny Scot? Shillings pour in and the toil gets tougher. This sawn-off brownie has grown into a girl guide who's gone at the knees. However, it's all in the game to a good girl guide, even if she has to apply the mean test. Meanwhile, the royal tour continued, and into the Derwent River sailed Gothic, taking the royal visitors to the southernmost part of the Commonwealth, to Hobart, where the Apple Islanders turned out in their thousands to express warm-hearted loyalty. Then it was on to Adelaide, where the royal party attended divine service at St. Peter's Cathedral. Prince Philip made a quick trip to the rocket range, there to be presented with a genuine woomera, or spear thrower, and watch a test flight of the Australian-designed Jindavick, Aboriginal term for a weapon carrier, the first remote-controlled pilotless jet aircraft in the world. Into this new jet age came a sudden and urgent demand for uranium. Prospectors armed with Geiger counters instead of picks and pans flocked into the Cloncurry Mount Isa district of northwest Queensland when news of the big strike leaked out. Soon, the first commercial contract for the sale of uranium to the United Kingdom and America was signed, involving a £10 million capital outlay to establish the mining township of Mary Kathleen, an atomic bonanza of the 50s. In 1954, the Royal and Ancient St Andrews Club was the venue for the British Open Championships. South Africa's Bobby Locke was a favourite to win again. Norman von Nyder was in top form. But all eyes were on 24-year-old Peter Thompson, runner-up in the two previous years. After finishing sixth at his first attempt in 1951, Peter was never headed during the 4 rounds, despite this missed putt. A score of 283 made him the first Australian to win the famous event, a feat he was to repeat in 1955, 56, and again in 1958.
I'm very happy, as you can see. And I know my wife is very happy also, wherever she is. I don't know where she is.
Australia was also well to the fore at Vancouver in Canada at the Empire Games. Proudly, wrestler Garrard carried the standard at the opening ceremony. True to form, the Lithgow Flash, Marjorie Jackson, won the sprint double, equaling the game's record of 10.7 in the 100 and equaling her own world record of 24 seconds in the 220. Lorraine Krapp, holder of every world record from 100 yards to a mile, also scored a thrilling double, winning the 110 yards freestyle in 65.8 seconds and the quarter mile in 5 minutes 11 seconds, both new Empire Games records. The The mile of the century between the rivals Dr. Roger Bannister of England in white, first to break the 4-minute barrier, and Australian John Landy, who had only a few weeks previously created a new world record in Finland. 80 yards to go, and Bannister passed Landy with what he called his finishing kick. What a kick! With a time of 3:38.8, only 4 seconds outside Landy's record, Bannister won by 4 yards. Obviously a supreme effort. Then in the marathon came the highlight of the games. English team captain Jim Peters, who had run 100 miles a week for 3 years in training, staggered into the arena for the final lap 15 minutes ahead of his nearest rival. A crowd of 35,000 cheered, then gasped as Peters fell 4 times, staggered across the line, and collapsed unconscious. He recovered in hospital to learn that he'd been disqualified because his team manager had touched him 200 yards from the finish. "I would not have minded dying if I'd won for England," he said. In Fremantle, it was home and England for the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh after their 2-month tour of Australia, a visit which took them to every state. It was a time to say farewell, time to board the royal yacht. A handshake for the Prime Minister and Dame Patty, and a final word with the Governor-General, Sir William Slim and Lady Slim. There have been many departures from this western port, but never one more heavily tinged with emotion. This was an occasion overflowing with gratitude and pride that Australia had been privileged to play host to the Queen of Australia. Canberra, May 3rd, 1954. Memories of the royal visit are overshadowed by the opening of the most sensational espionage case in our history, the Petrov Inquiry, an investigation which was to last many months and make headlines around the world, as 3 Supreme Court judges heard evidence from 116 witnesses, not only in Canberra, but also in Sydney and Melbourne. Central figure was Vladimir Petrov, 47 years old, 3rd Secretary of the Soviet Embassy, who was also a Lieutenant Colonel in the Russian Secret Police, in charge of non-military espionage in Australia. Second figure was his wife, listed as secretary to the Russian ambassador, assisting her husband to decode spy communications to and from Moscow. By April 6th, Petrov had defected and was granted political asylum. The Russian embassy asserted that he'd been kidnapped and had embezzled embassy funds. The ambassador and his staff were ordered home. Mrs. Petrov, driven to Sydney to fly back to Russia, was escorted by 2 Soviet couriers who'd been specially flown to Australia for the mission. At Kingsford Smith Airport, hundreds of anti-communist New Australians staged a dramatic protest at her forced departure and tried in vain to prevent her being put aboard the plane. The unexpected hysterical outburst at the airport endangered not only Mrs. Petrov and the waiting aircraft, but hundreds of onlookers, pressmen and airport officials, as police strove to keep the demonstration within the law. This savage action almost toppled Mrs. Petrov and her escorts to the ground. At 5 o'clock next morning in Darwin, after her escorts had been relieved of their pistols, Mrs. Petrov telephoned her husband in Sydney, and then she too was granted asylum. Her angry, frustrated escorts flew on to Russia. 2 years later, Petrov and his wife became naturalized Australians and were paid £5,000 by the Australian Security Service for the loss of his job and personal savings. The 2 central figures in a sensational highlight of 1954. A year to remember.